What's going on, guys? This is Ryan B from Underground Reptiles, and this week I wanted to feature one of my favorite animals, actually a few of them. These are Crested Geckos. These are a New Caledonia gecko, and that's what we're going to be featuring this week. Is a few different types of New Caledonia geckos. We've been working with New Caledonia geckos here at Underground Reptiles for quite some time. Here are a few very active young pinstripe crested geckos. Males and females are pretty easy to distinguish. Males get good sized hemipenal bulges. You can actually sex them at around this size by doing what's called looping. You take a jeweler's loop, you look right near the cloaca, and there's some pores. So these guys are sexable. This is what's called a pinstripe crested gecko. We've also started working with the lily white morph. You'll see more of those here at Underground Reptiles in the near future. But this is just to give you an idea of just how cool these geckos look. Now we also offer what's called the premium crested gecko, which is just as colorful. It doesn't have as nice of the pinstripe markings down the back as some of the others do. We also work with phantom pinstripes, Halloweens, brindles, tigers, super tigers. There's a myriad of different names out there for some of the different types. The only true morph that we're aware of, there's actually two of them. One's the axanthic morph, the other one's the lily white morph. And again, you'll be seeing those probably this year, more and more of those available. But most of these are just line bred. And that's how you get some of the different color variations, from like more of a mocha, which is like a brownish color, to some of the more flame red, orange. We work with several different types here. But again, this is just to give you an idea of how cool some of the cresteds that we produce here at Underground Reptiles look. Full grown, about 5-6 inches tip to tip. And what's really neat about these guys, it's a great animal to start working with, great pet. They don't require a whole lot. They feed on what's called Crested Gecko diet. What makes it really cool is it's a powder diet you can keep in your refrigerator. After you open it, you mix it in with some water. Some people do yogurt, like myself, like a fruit on the bottom yogurt, which is great. Helps replenish some calcium and fat, especially if you have like breeding females. And then they'll also eat live insects as well. I probably give my guys live insects at least twice a week, and then another 2 to 3 times a week they're getting fresh Crested Gecko diet. And the diet is pretty much the same thing for both your cresteds and your gargoyles and your Chahouas and your Leachies, all the different New Caledonia geckos, again, that we work with here. They love to be kept cool. These guys prefer, most of the New Caledonia geckos prefer nothing that gets really over 80 degrees. The area that they come from, it's a little island area that's just east of Australia. And what's really cool about that area is that it stays fairly temperate all year long. Doesn't really get above 80 degrees. These guys are also primarily nocturnal. So you'll see them active and eating more in the evening time as opposed to daytime right now. Again, really pretty color, an animal with tons of variation from patterning to color to morph. And these guys are available right here at Underground Reptiles. Alright guys, this next gecko is called a Chahoua Gecko. It's actually reclassified the scientific name this year. It used to be classified as Arachidactylus. It's been changed thus. I think the pronunciation is like Minya Gecko. I don't even know how to pronounce it. But this is a really, really neat gecko. There are 2 main types. You have the Pine Island and Main Island. We primarily work with the Main Islands. However, we do have some Pine Islands that we make available on occasion. The Main Islands that we work with here, though, we have 2 variations. We have the higher red line, which you're already starting to see some of that red patterning come out on this guy. Those were brought in from Europe originally. This guy has a really cool red eye too, kind of funky looking one. Pricing on these guys has really skyrocketed over the last couple years. They're a harder gecko to reproduce. Cresteds produce very well. Leachies produce very well. Gargoyles more sporadic. Chahouas even more sporadic than that. And then you have Cerasonorums, which unfortunately we don't have any today to show you, but are producing even less frequently than any of those geckos. Now this is a gecko species, gets a little bit larger than your gargoyles, a little bit larger than your cresteds and Cerasonorums, but not quite as big as the Leachies. So if you're looking for something that's rare, kind of intermediate, These guys are a great gecko. Some people have even in the last few years started hybridizing them with cresteds. You know, I'll be honest with you, I know some people are purists and are anti-hybrid. We're not. You know, we think hybridization is fine in captivity. It also happens naturally in the wild on occasion. But again, just for appreciating for what it is, Chahoua Gecko is a great gecko with some funky patterning, definitely a little bit rarer to find. And the high red lines and even some of the model patterning ones that we just started working with in the last year are just in big demand. Pine Islands are a little bit rarer than the main island ones, and they actually will have a white, almost like a white shoulder patterning that goes across here. That's typically how you determine or tell a difference between a main island and a pine island. These guys have also a prehensile tail, similar to the cresteds and the gargoyles. Also, similar to Saracenorbs. Leachies technically do, but it's a much stubbier tail, and it's really not used typically like these guys will use theirs. Much longer tail on them. This is the Chahoua Gecko, also from New Caledonia, right here, now available at Underground Reptiles. All right, so this next gecko that I want to show you guys is called a Gargoyle Gecko. This is actually one of the first New Caledonia geckos that I started working with and became interested in. This kind of got me on that whole New Caledonia gecko kick, if you want to call it that. The reason why they call them Gargoyle Geckos is because they actually develop these weird little horns. You won't see it on the babies as much, but as they get older, it's not really even horns. It's these two little ridges on the top of the head that kind of protrude up like horns. Also, if you get a close shot, I don't know how close George can get in on that, but the eyes look like this kind of shattered marble or shattered stone. Now these guys have a pretty similar diet to that of the Crested Geckos, same kind of setup. These are arboreal geckos, so I try to tell people, try to keep them or start them off in like an arboreal cage. Something like a 12 by 12 by 18 is great to start them off in, and they could live pretty much their whole lives in something like that, unless you're going to start putting them together in breeding groups. Now while Crested Geckos tend to do well in groups together, Gargoyle Geckos can actually be a little bit more aggressive. We definitely don't recommend mixing them with other species like Cresteds, Chahuas, or Leachies. That's the same thing goes for the Chahuas and Leachies as well. But the Gargoyle Geckos have a tendency to do this to each other. I'll show you. See that? It's a missing tail. Now they do regenerate, unlike Crested Geckos. Crested Geckos will not regenerate their tails. Gargoyles will. I don't want to keep these guys too close together, but this is a larger Gargoyle Gecko, as you can see here. This is what we would refer to typically as like an orange blotch or orange stripe. That's more of a red stripe line. It looks kind of orangish now, but as he gets older, it'll deepen and darken up. The two most common patterns amongst Gargoyle Geckos is going to be your stripe patterning and your reticulated patterning, or blotch patterning, sometimes they call it. But just really vibrant reds and oranges. Then you got some of your more, like, you have white stripe lines and some of your darker lines as well. I've even got a couple of breeders that I started working with this year that are like fluorescent pink, so I'm hoping to show off some of their babies this year. But really cool gecko. If you look closely, again, that's where you start to see those little ridges or horns, and if you were here you could even touch it and you kind of feel like a little bump on the head. But such cool eyes. They get that shattered patterning. It almost looks like inside the eyes makes it look like stone, and that's one of my favorite things to actually watch them do right there, is when they stick out their tongue. When they're eating, you'll see them do that quite a bit. You know, they're not voracious eaters unless it's insects. Typically, they'll go over to like a plate of Crested Gecko diet or any of the, like the Pangea diets, and you'll just kind of see them stick out their tongue a little bit, kind of lap it up slowly. But these are Gargoyle Geckos. Again, another animal that we breed here at Underground Reptiles. Again, I wouldn't recommend keeping them together, and that's just so you can avoid them losing their tails. When it does regenerate, it doesn't quite look the same as the original tail. But again, just a really cool gecko to start working with, easy to keep and maintain, and they're available right here at Underground Reptiles. All right, so I think I've saved the best for last here when it comes to New Caledonia geckos, and that is the Leachianus gecko. Brachydactylus leachianus. It is the largest gecko in the world, and again, you have a few different island localities, typically with your GT or your Type A's, which tend to get to the largest, to some of your like offshore islands, your Nuanas, Nuamis, which say a little bit smaller, and typically also a little bit more patterned and brightly colored. This one that I'm holding in my hand is at Mount Kogus. It's a little bit lighter than your typical Mount Kogus. The lines that we started working with several years back, and now we have a few different lines that we work with, was a lighter line that came out of Europe originally. Now this Mount Kogus will typically stay, won't get as much, as much patterning on the sides or on top like my Nuanas or the Nuanas that we work with here. We work with some like really pretty like high pink Nuanas, and you'll see patterning, pink blotches all over the place. Now you'll get some on the sides here with your Mount Kogus. I don't know if you can see that in the light as well. All right. But again, typically speaking, not as much patterning or color as like your Nuanas, Nuamis. In fact, this year, we also just started working with Pine Islands, or I'm sorry, not this year, but about a couple years ago, started working with Pine Islands. And then last year, picked up some really funky purple, almost hypo-ish looking lychees that we plan on putting out for you guys this year. There is always big demand. It seems like demand on these guys is just increased. And the main reason isn't just because they're hard to produce. I mean, typically speaking, when you pair them up, they produce fairly regularly. In fact, it's rare that I've ever had an issue with any females not producing or producing infertile eggs. They produce on a fairly consistent basis. They do take a little bit longer to incubate the eggs as opposed to crested geckos. So you're not getting them as often as a crested gecko, but you're still getting eggs on a regular basis. What makes these guys tough to come by, and the reason why there's a high demand for them, is because typically speaking, male and females need to bond. You can't just take, like I could take a crested gecko more or less and put it, a male, and put it with 2-3 other females, bounce them around to different groups. He'll breed with them all, the females will breed with him. Leachies don't operate that way. Typically speaking, with leachies, you got to pair them one male, one female, and you got to be really, really careful. I pair mine up at around 6 months of age. When I can loop them, I start keeping them together. And the reason being is because if they don't bond with each other, males and females can become quite aggressive. I've even heard stories of males and females killing each other, ripping off tails, limbs. They actually get, as we said before, pretty big, and the bite on an adult lychee is no joke. Typically speaking, they don't bite. They're not aggressive animals. Males can be a little bit territorial. They'll make this weird chirping and clicking noise when they get agitated. But again, just a really cool, chill gecko. As you can see, these geckos aren't jumping around as much as the Cresteds and the Gargoyles and the Chahouas were. They're much more relaxed gecko. So it's a long-lived gecko. It's a gecko that does very well in captivity. Also easy to keep on the crested gecko diet, insects as well. Same diet as all the other New Caledonian geckos. But again, just an animal whose value continues to increase, an animal that continues to be in greater demand, and just a cool animal to work with. Again, if you want something different, something unique, something you're gonna have for a long time, a Leachianus gecko, Leachianus or giant Leachianus gecko is definitely the way to go. One of my favorites. In fact, the whole reason why I got into Crested Gargoyles, I started breeding those guys. And this is maybe just an encouragement for anybody who's just starting to get into the hobby and breeding. You know, you see those animals that they're at a price point, you're just like, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to produce something like that or work with something like that. Start off with something smaller and start selling them. I started with with Cresteds and Gargoyles, and finally I produced enough and made enough money off of them that I could finally afford one of the geckos I really wanted, which was the giant Leachianus gecko. And now I've got several pairs that we've got breeding for us on a regular basis, and even more that are going to be available soon. So again, check them out. All these geckos are available on our website at undergroundreptiles.com. Peace!